Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to another session of our Yellow Couch podcast. My absolute privilege today to have with me Adrian Saville, who's become a very good friend over the last couple of years. Now, Adrian is from GIBS, Cam and Boundless World, and I'm going to read you what is an absolutely impressive CV. With over 25 years of experience in capital markets and investment management, Adrian works across public and private markets in all major asset classes, managing a concentrated global equity fund since 2007 and a high conviction deep value fund with a track record that dates from 1996. He combines his investment career with academic excellence and thought leadership. Adrian is a professor of economics and finance at the Gordon Institute of Business Science and a visiting professor of strategic management at the Rotman School of Management in Toronto, where he teaches, researches, and publishes on topics related to economics, finance, and strategy. Adrian has developed and authored innovative tools that measure and monitor economic integration, economic performance, investment impact, and firm strategy across markets. He's also the founding director of the Center for African Management and Markets and a member of the Academy of International Business, a global network of scholars and practitioners in international business. Wow, Adrian, wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for joining.
Good to be with you, Hennie. If I could get my squash to be as good as that.
And I'm quite serious. He's a real mean squash player. I had the privilege of being up against him on Tuesday, and I'm still recovering. So, just for the record,
I'm recovering double.
So, Adrian, this morning we're going to talk a little bit about the US aid and the impact that the withdrawal of that has had on the continent. And you've worked across the continent. You've done a lot of work for other institutions on the continent. And in the next 40 or 45 minutes, I'd be quite eager to unpack the impact, in your view, of this on Africa. And I think maybe just to set the scene for me, it's actually not such a crisis. And I'd be curious to know if in your mind it's such a big crisis. And for me, this is such a wonderful opportunity for us as a continent to actually move from that whole aid to trade concept. So maybe just to kind of kick us off, Adrian, you've spent years, as I've said in your intro, on advising governments and industry across Africa on trade and investment. And the US is now frozen, the foreign aid, and of course there's a tariff issue that's also playing out quite loudly everywhere in the moment. How significant is this as a combo for this continent?
Let's start here. What good news.
Tell me more.
So I think around the aid issue, you immediately have the story getting in the way of facts. And here's the reality, that aid comes with all of the right intention and all of the wrong results. If you can show me a country that has become successful through the receipt of aid, you are talking about an exception of an exception. Overwhelmingly, countries that have received aid, and we're not talking about one or two countries, and we're not talking about 1 or 2 years, it's not cherry picking data. Overwhelmingly, countries that are the recipients of aid are locked into poverty, that aid doesn't deliver what the heart intends. So, first, let's just, deal with the emotion of it or the intention of it.
Because there's quite a lot of emotion behind that, isn't it? We all get so caught up in the emotion of it.
And no one gives, donates with bad intent.
Right.
You're giving with all of the good meaning.
Yeah.
And this goes from you and me as individuals in our private capacity all the way up to multilateral organizations like the World Bank. Everyone's intention is to do good. The reality, and probably the person who has been most vocal on this and delivered some of the most compelling evidence, even if in places it's anecdotal, is the Zambian-born economist Dambisa Moyo. And she talks about dead aid, that aid delivers death. Aid doesn't deliver uh, prosperity and abundance. And there's a whole lot of reasons, which I think is an important aspect of any conversation about why this is actually a good story.
Mm.
There's a whole lot of reasons why aid keeps people bound in poverty and why it doesn't do what we imagine.
So I just want to go back to one of the first comments you made, as you said countries who depends on aid are locked into poverty.
Yep.
Is that unique to Africa, or is this everywhere
No,
around
it's
the world?
global. So, and I think that there's an important point about that. I said there's no cherry picking going on here. I don't have going on in the back of my head one or two countries that haven't done well, and therefore there's the evidence. Overwhelmingly, almost universally, countries that have been given aid in order to develop have just been hamstrung. I'll give you one example. I've already given the case of, or I've already made reference to Dambisa Moyo from Zambia. She does a back of the envelope calculation, and she said if Zambia had applied its aid with an investment lens as opposed to a donation lens, in other words, if they had spent the money effectively and wisely, Zambia's per person income today would be in the region of $20,000 per person, which would make them a rich country. Instead, Zambia sits with $1,000 per person territory. So that shows you the yawning difference. Malawi is another case in point. I'm using African examples, but I think that speaks to our context. Malawi has had more money spent inside of the country through aid than through government spending since its independence. More money through aid than government spending.
Right.
And Malawi ranks as one of the poorest countries in the world. So those are just two examples. But and they're African examples, but we can go elsewhere. And perhaps just a quick point to make while I've got the mic is this must be distinct from humanitarian crisis.
Because I was about to go there.
Yeah. So this is not about earthquakes, flooding, disaster, war relief. That is quite distinct. And interestingly, the money spent on humanitarian crisis is a fraction of the money spent on development, which means what we are really doing with this development aid is we're doing damage.
Adrian, just on that, how much of the aid that we receive or received in the past was earmarked for infrastructure development versus humanitarian care outside of a crisis, i.e., earthquakes, flooding, etc.? Do you have a feel for what that split is?
There's sequencing here, Hennie, and the sequencing, the story goes something like this. Aid really comes to prominence in the 1960s, where you have the wave of independence sweeping through Africa in particular. And that meant that the first effort, the first endeavor was to build out infrastructure. That how do we install the necessary infrastructure, rail, logistics infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, so on and so forth. The next set in the series was to then put industry on top of that infrastructure. And that's the 1960s into the early 1970s. Now, any student of history knows that the 1970s delivers a spectacular crisis. It's called the oil crisis. And it sparks inflation, global recession, and these industrial efforts then came to very little. So you've borrowed this money to build infrastructure, or even if it's soft funding, to build infrastructure, build factories. You've now got global recession. Interest rates have gone up because inflation has gone higher. Production has gone down because of the contracting economy, and you're in economic crisis. And so quickly, the aid story shifted from infrastructure to industry to, well, now we need to worry about people.
Mm.
and we need to spend on education, healthcare, and ultimately by the 1980s, it's
Right.
poverty relief. And you can think of Live Aid and Bob Geldof,
Mm.
Bono, singing songs for famine, etc.,
Mm. Mm.
as it rolls into the 1990s.
That's a great segue into my next question. So, are we saying this is actually a catalyst for a fundamental shift in how we approach development in Africa?
Yeah, yeah. As I'm answering your first question, I'm thinking, Adrian, you've actually missed a data point.
All right.
Here's the data point that I missed when I said aid, has a universally bad. It has a bad history. That's not entirely true. Can I go back and
Of course
correct
you can.
myself?
Yeah.
Because the birth of aid, in terms of facilitating development, is after World War II.
Mm.
There is a huge however in that statement. And the plan that was unleashed was called the Marshall Aid Plan.
Mm. Mm.
And it was brought by funding by the United States to help Europe rebuild. The however is the Europe that the US was going to fund had institutional memory and industrial memory. They weren't building from scratch. So they were restoring and repairing and putting back into order things that had been destroyed by war.
Mm.
And so there's a big part of the aid story then that can be told through that. And it's the importance of having institutions as one of your most important capabilities. And if you don't have institutions, you're probably pouring money into a hole.
Okay. And thank you for bringing that in, Adrian. But then back to the question. Is this the catalyst for
I lost the
development?
question. Yeah.
Is this now that we understand the timelines and the origin of aid and how it came about, some of the impact. Now, of course, losing it. Is it a crisis or is it an opportunity?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, it is both, because if you think of pulling funding away immediately from people who are dependent on this funding, and it's you and I, sit here in this nice, comfortable chair. We'll go out afterwards, have another coffee, and we'll go home to good meals tonight. Our children are educated. You know, imagine if our circumstance was we are reliant on aid. That is the way that we feed our children, educate our children, look after them medically. And here we sit, in our middle class bliss, saying, no, aid is bad. So we can't lose sight of the fact that there are people that are families, communities, even countries that are heavily reliant on aid. And so this immediately translates into crisis. And so what's the bridge from pulling that funding away and helping people into? But now what's the helping? Because the helping can't be more money or different money. It's got to be something different.
And what does that look like?
You know the secret to that.
So I've got two questions for you.
Isn't that your business?
Is the secret then trade?
It's
And there's a second part, sorry, Adrian, to that question.
No.
In that, because clearly there's an interim period where this is going to sting.
Yeah.
What are the options? Do we start looking to the African Union? Is that an option? Do we start looking at this BRICS relationship? Or do we actually just understand that there's going to be a short to medium period where it's going to really sting, and we put all of our efforts into moving from aid into trade, and we start stimulating trade both domestically and internationally?
So let's try and make it something that will perhaps resonate or make sense to us as individuals, rather than thinking about the country level or what do governments have to do and policymakers. Imagine your circumstance as you're a dad, right? And your kids finish school and they go searching for their first job. And you've got the ability to support them, to finance them. You can probably look after them for quite a long while. But if we get to your 18-year-old has become a 28-year-old and they're still living on the Hennie Heymans handout,
Mm.
they are now, will they ever pull away from that dependency?
Mm.
So there is a transition that needs to happen here, because equally you can't tell your kids, on the day that they finish school, well, good luck, go and get a job.
Mm.
If you've got the means.
Sorry, kids.
I'm looking to mine too. If you've got the means, and
Yeah.
we are privileged that you and I have the means to do this, but you want to transition them,
Mm.
and I'm going to pull this away from you. I'm not going to fund your university education. You're going to have to pay for your dentistry, your medical, the insurance, and the petrol becomes your charge, and ideally as quickly as possible.
Mm.
The longer you take it, the longer they will remain dependent. And ultimately, if you land up with, let's be silly with and stay with my anecdote. If you land up with an unemployed 28-year-old, you now have an unemployable 28-year-old. So how do we get this transition right? How do we wean countries off this? And there are good examples that we can go to.
So I'd like you to cite some of those examples. But as part of that, I wonder, how do we weave into it this incredible youth demographic dividend that we sit with in the continent? Is there something that we can mix up and make this work that can help stimulate the economies?
Yeah, there's a lot in there, Henny, and I'm sure you've got ideas on some of the things that are necessary. You've been to what, every country in Africa,
Not quite,
almost
but
every.
a few, yeah.
So you've got a huge basket of evidence of stuff,
Right.
that you could drop into that conversation. I think that there's three key components to harness this demographic dividend. The first is institutions. I've already made reference to that. And what I mean by institutions are the rules that arrange and order society, the way in which you and I interact. And so that goes all the way from hard institutions like property rights, functioning justice, criminal justice systems, legal systems, reserve banks that work, receiver of revenues that gather up revenue and spend it wisely. Those are the hard institutions. And the soft institutions are things like social cohesion and trust. If those institutions are absent, all bets are off.
Mm.
When those institutions are absent, corruption goes highest, and that's where aid is its most dysfunctional.
Mm.
So, in fact, there is a way in which aid in and of itself could become far more functional, and that's obsessing about institutional fabric. That's one of the first things that needs to, I think that's our subject of interest. The second is in worrying about the capability of your youth, this demographic dividend that you're referring to. You're familiar with the work that we've done on the 6-factor model, which are the 6 ingredients that are common to countries that transition and transform.
Mm.
When it comes to human capabilities, the first mover is healthcare. So interestingly, development policy very often puts education first, imagining that you can educate your way to prosperity. But education without healthcare is a little bit like aid without institutions, that you need to get healthcare right first. And now it becomes even more magnificent. The most effective healthcare happens in the first 1,000 days, where the required spend is amongst the lowest of all healthcare spend, and the returns on human capital are the highest, and they go on for the rest of your life. And then the third thing, so I've argued about institutions, I've argued about healthcare. The third thing is about infrastructure. And I don't need to tell you anything about infrastructure. How important.
Our Achilles heel.
Yeah.
Our
You've got to
Achilles
have
heel.
some stories here.
It's our Achilles heel. People often say, why is logistics so expensive? And I mean, you know the numbers better than what I do. But
No,
it's
I don't.
argued that
You tell me the
that
numbers.
logistics makes up as much as 44% of the final value of the goods that we sell on this continent,
Africa,
as opposed to
compare
3
that
to
to.
5% in Europe.
You're kidding.
And that is absolutely because of the lack of infrastructure. Here's a couple of throwaway facts on that. Only 12% of cities in Africa are serviced by one commercial flight a week. How do you make that work? And therefore, this infrastructure thing and it's been so much debated and spoken about, yet we still see so little happening in terms of that. Even in South Africa, which is the most developed economy on the continent, I think that's fair to say. It's only back to around about the early 80% mark of its commercial connectivity to pre-COVID. Now just ponder on that for a moment.
So that's a lagging scar.
100%. And the question is, if we are not back there now in 2025, will we ever get back there? But a conversation for a different day.
Can I just stay there for 1 second
Of
before
course,
you go on?
yeah.
If I'm doing back of the envelope maths, but if we take that, you said 44%.
Correct.
Versus 3 or 4%. So just getting infrastructure right would drop the cost of our final consumer good. The cost of my household budget would fall by 40%.
It'll fall by an enormous percentage.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we don't even talk about is, imagine you can only access your goods once a week. Yeah. Now that, to what extent the 44 includes the cost of capital, but the cost of time.
Yeah.
That cost of time,
so it's
nobody
not just
talks
the price
about
point. It's about the availability
100%. And technology, for example, Adrian, is moving so quickly. Imagine you've got to wait a week for something from a technology point of view. It's already lost. It's like saying ABBA has just reached the top 10 kind of Springbok music ranking. That's kind of the same effect in today's world.
That you're getting news from.
Exactly. ABBA is number one. Well, that was in 1979 when
we
never played. And, my parents liked ABBA, just for the record. But yeah.
I think you did too.
I'm about to break. I won't break into song. But yeah, it is enormous. And
can I just say something also
Sure.
about that? I gave a list of 3 where I spoke about institutions, infrastructure, healthcare. Can I hitch onto that infrastructure story? A deficit that we are staring down the barrel of, and it's the digital deficit, because the world is in awe of what's happening with AI, speed,
right.
big data, machines, robotics, etc. But if our youth is not deep in this ocean of data with digital abundance, it'll be another hollowing out.
Absolutely. And this is the dichotomy of this continent, right? You talk about AI and digital and the youth. And then you look at some of the examples that you have in Nigeria that's got its own Silicon Valley. If you talk about a Rwanda that's got its own Silicon Valley. You talk about a Kenya. Recently been to Ethiopia, and I did not know that it's become a hot address for Bitcoin miners.
Okay.
To go to Ethiopia, that you probably pop across to the next country and people don't have access to electricity.
Yeah.
How is that for a dichotomy and complete opposites? But Adrian, I want to go back. You spoke about institutions, one of the 3 things that you raised, and I want to kind of use that as an opportunity to jump to the Africa Free Trade Agreement. Where does that feature in all of this, in your mind?
Sure. So, you raised this trade issue earlier and we skipped over it. One of the most powerful enablers and displacers of aid dependence is trade. And here I can be animated. We've just written a paper with you, with DHL, talking about trade displacing aid. There is a broad body of evidence that shows the impact, the contribution that trade can make to building social prosperity, industrial competitiveness, company performance. Trade is a very, very powerful enabler. The DHL Global Connectedness work speaks about trade, capital, information, and people, the four things that go across borders. And of these different components, trade is one of the single biggest drivers of helping lift countries. Let's put it in an anecdotal way. Name a country that has become rich by building walls and locking itself away. Now, I'm not saying that trade, therefore, in and of itself is a good thing. That's a bit like saying, marriage is the source of happiness. We do know that people who report happiness are in good relationships.
I thought you were going to say single, but sorry.
Sorry,
I got distracted there for a moment.
So those two things go together, but we also know that dysfunctional relationships can be the source of misery. So it's not trade that we're after, it's functional trade that we're after. And what I mean by functional trade is win-win outcomes. What is it that causes you and me, by being in a relationship together in business, exchanging goods or services, what is it that causes us to both be better off? And you might get relatively better off than me, but by being in this trade connection, we're both better off. That's what we're after. We're after that win-win outcome.
But there are a few challenges. You spoke about digitalization a little bit earlier on, and that's probably one of the big challenges. But
infrastructure
and all the rest of it. But just a little bit back to the Africa Free Trade Agreement. It's rule-based. Are we comfortable that in its current format, it is enough to stimulate what we need, especially against the context of us losing aid, feeling a little bit lonely at the moment? Is there enough in this Africa Free Trade Agreement to get us to where we should have been and should be?
There's enough on paper to be academic about it. There's enough on paper because it has all of the composition of other successful trade aggregations that we've seen. Europe is a fantastically successful trade aggregation. Southeast Asia, Asia more broadly, fantastic trade aggregation. And so it has, in its essence, all of that is on the table. I think what you need is you need a mindset aspect and you need a physical aspect. I'm going to bang on about this infrastructure thing. The infrastructure that Africa sits with, that's a sweeping statement. I mean, Africa's spectacularly diverse. But if we think about the continent in the aggregate, the infrastructure that the continent sits with in the aggregate is the infrastructure that was built to extract. It's extractive infrastructure. Your work is to fix that and to make it connecting infrastructure, networked infrastructure. And you know the data on this, how much trade happens pan-Africa, intra-Africa. If we go to Asia, 50% of trade is intra-Asian. If we go to Europe, 50% of trade is intra-European. If we come to Africa, 10% of trade is intra-African, which means it's very hard for us to find win-win relationships because I'm making the same things as you. So you don't want to buy what I've got. We need to go and find other people. So the first requirement is not only do we need to establish these networks and connectedness internally, we then need to start building out different things that each other needs. And that's how we start to build the win-win outcome. The mindset reference that I'm making is to regulators who are progressive, to policymakers who are progressive, and who see unequivocally the merit in this. I can't look any further than East Africa as evidence of incredible gains and advances that have been made through regional integration. I think that's our textbook.
But Adrian, you talk about the infrastructure and the dire need for us to really double down on it. But then we talk about the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which to a large degree talks about abolishing the duties and excise taxes on goods intra-Africa. But doesn't that put us in a bit of a conundrum? Because if we lose those taxes, how do we fund the infrastructure? How do governments then go about to finding funds for the infrastructure? That is often debated publicly. What are your thoughts? So how do they make up for that perceived loss from a duty and excise point of view?
Can I hang on to that question?
Sure.
I'll keep it, but can I ask you back, what's your thought on African continental free trade? What do you think about it?
So
the agreement.
I'm incredibly positive about it for a few reasons. Probably most important for me is it provides us the platform to trade our way to prosperity from a continent point of view. I think my frustration is that the message doesn't seem to get from the brain to the hands from an execution point of view. If you look at the number of certificates of origin that has been issued so far, it's only 10,000. Now, when I raised it with the secretary the other day, I was very quickly told that I should not be as impatient as I am, because it's 10,000 more than what we've ever had. But I don't think time is on our side. I think if we look at how geopolitics are shifting.
Just help me understand or interpret that 10,000 number.
So
what should the number be? Or like, what would cause you to be delighted?
I think that should be 10,000 a week. It should be 100,000 a week. It should be 500,000.
As opposed to 10,000 over a couple of years.
As opposed to 10,000. That means that we've seen only 10,000 pockets or products, whatever the case may be, that is benefited under the Africa Free Trade Agreement. We still seem to be looking for markets outside of the continent. And I haven't done it, but my gut tells me if you overlay the 10,000, the number, the sheer number, versus how many we've sent abroad to China or India or Europe, it's probably a rounding error. And I think that's where the opportunity sits for us.
So that's the mindset story also, right?
It's the mindset, it's the education, and it's to demystify it. I really think there's an enormous task ahead of us to demystify what the Africa Free Trade Agreement really means for the SME on the ground, who employs 2 or 3 people, that works in his or her garage, producing something that somebody in a neighboring country or somewhere on this continent may have an appetite for.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier, I referenced earlier a couple of countries that we could go to for examples, case studies that we could learn from. And as you say that, I immediately think of Southeast Asian economies that went from being backroom sort of assembly businesses doing cheap goods to today being global powerhouses. South Korea has to be our role model on that.
How do we learn from them?
That industrialization is fueled by global markets rather than local markets. In other words, the positioning that you need to take is I ultimately need to build to be globally competitive. Even if my market initially is local, the thinking has to be, I will ultimately scale to global. And that's about ambition. That's about intent. I think that, so I don't want to overuse the term, but that's sort of a mindset, a purpose and intent attribute. The second is, I referenced progressive policymakers. And progressive policymakers, in the case of South Korea, they really helped facilitate that global integration, helping small manufacturers find global channels and corridors. And the third is that industrialization isn't a leap. It's a stutter. That you stutter and stumble and you make very, very modest refinements, and you don't go from sort of assembling kettles to doing jetpacks. You go from assembling kettles to then being able to wire, doing wiring. Then you actually figure out how you manufacture the kettles, not assemble them. Then the kettles become microwave ovens. Then the microwave ovens become television sets, etc., etc.
Is that really holding true? And I'll tell you why I ask you the question. If we look at what happened with telephony on this continent, we skipped many of those stages. If you look at the Safaricom story, which is now a well-known story on the continent,
Sure.
we skipped so many of those phases that traditionally we would have thought we need to get through in order to get to that incredible magical moment. And what they proved was able. So is it really necessary for us to do that?
Yes, because I think that my hesitation or reservation is that I think what you're describing is as users rather than as producers. So let's go back to our kids. They're not going to go into a bank. They will be digital, probably forever. They can't think of a single reason to go into a bank. And the only reason that they can do that is they are born digitally native. And those platforms exist. So, I take your point that you might be able to leapfrog as a user. I'm not sure that you can go from doing basic production to suddenly doing sophisticated mobile data products that you can just leapfrog in that way. Even if it is inside of that data industry, it might be first I'm going to do rudimentary data stuff, then more sophisticated, then ultimately I'll become the guru. So it's still an iterative process, even if it might be with more sophisticated products.
Adrian, I want to get back to the point you made on South Korea, and I suspect we might be running a little bit short on time, but let me just ask you two questions on that. We've now covered the infrastructure dilemma a few times, and you spoke about industrialization. In the context of us losing so much of the aid, is that an investment opportunity for others into the continent? If you look at the UAE, who's suddenly become the top FDI investor on the continent, we know Turkey has become incredibly interested. We know India is showing immense interest. We know China has been investing quite heavily on the continent. Is this an opportunity for FDI to increase substantially? Almost, whilst there's a little bit of a vacuum, if you want.
Yeah. And that takes us back to your earlier point about financing, which I said, let's not forget. So there's a couple of ways in which you could finance this. You could finance this through foreign portfolio investment, which means the money comes in as perhaps a slightly longer term loan, government bonds, longer dated credit. That's one way in which you could do it. The challenge with foreign portfolio investment is it's a funder, but it's not really a builder. It doesn't really build capabilities. FDI, which you flagged, foreign direct investment, that's the bricks and mortar stuff. That's gold. Because foreign direct investment comes with a far more permanent mindset. It's a binding commitment that's thinking about decades, not years. It can't just pull up the pegs and leave when things go wrong. In fact, it has to try and figure out how it helps make things work better. And then you get spillovers and linkages that foreign direct investment will stimulate supply chains. And recognizing that the direct investor is foreign means that one of the supply chains that they most often stimulate is trade.
Wonderful. I've got to close. It's a final question. I want you to complete a sentence for all of us. Africa will succeed in moving from aid to trade when what?
Institutions are built.
Adrian, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest, Adrian Saville. Adrian's been fantastic. We can talk about this for hours, and I'm definitely going to see you back here. So thank you very much, and it was lovely having a conversation with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Hennie.
Yellow couch conversations, fueling dreams across the nations, bold insights and revelations. It's where we conversations.